Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Conversations on Conversations, where each week we explore a topic to help us have more powerful conversations with ourselves and others. I am your host friend, Sarah Noll Wilson, and joining me today is Lawrence Weinrauch, where we're going to be exploring this idea of what can modern masculinity look like now? And I'm so excited because this is a conversation he and I have been having over the years. And so I'm just looking forward to hopping into this. But let me tell you a little bit about Lawrence. Lawrence Weinrauch is the general manager of Turtleford Co-op, as well as the mayor of Turtleford in Saskatchewan. He is also the father to 4 of his own children and a stepdad to 2 more. In his spare time, Lawrence studies contemplative psychotherapy and spends his time outdoors with his wife and their 2 dogs. A Buddhist practitioner, Lawrence is fascinated by the mind and the dynamics of human interactions. Lawrence, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Take 2.
Yes.
You know, for our friends, we had some tech issues, so we're excited to be back, and the timing couldn't be better.
Yeah.
Lawrence, what else do you want us to know about you?
Well, I am fascinated with the mind and just that paradigm of how you're supposed to be, a man, a husband, and then a business leader or a community leader. And what all that means, and, where just the pressures and stuff that I guess you have to deal with.
Yeah.
And I am working on restoring a car, so that's my therapy right now.
Oh,
so,
yeah? What kind of car? Yeah.
1966 VW Beetle.
That's fantastic. Wait, what color? What color is it, or what color is it going to be?
Well,
is it like a classic black, or?
It's a black now, but I've been told I should paint it like a ladybug or something. So
yeah. I love that so much. I expect photos.
Yeah. No, I'll send
when
them.
It's done. Yeah. So as we get into this, as I shared, Lawrence and I connected through work that we did with his organization. And one of the things that struck me was one day in a conversation, you pushed us and was like, I feel like we just are continuing to perpetuate the patriarchy and how we approach this. And Teresa and I both looked at each other like, who the hell is this? Okay, let's have a conversation. And obviously this is a topic we've explored on the show in different ways of just understanding sometimes the ways that the expectations or the rules that aren't really rules are placed on us. So let's take us back a little bit, Lawrence. What inspired your journey to start interrogating what we've talked about as the unhealthy role of patriarchy in our culture and your life, right?
I think for me, it started I was working at a different company, and it was very much, there's that need for the bottom line. And I felt that my identity and my value as a person was more on how well I did at work rather than how well I did at home. So it actually ruined a marriage out of that whole thing. But it was just that exploration of what really is important in life and why is it that way. And then I got thinking back to, just the way my dad and mom interacted, and just that whole generational kind of learning, or whatever you want to call it. So that's kind of where it started. And then it was just realizing that you're humans dealing with other humans trying to get through this life together. So why not find a better way that's more holistic in a way?
Yeah. It's I don't know that I've ever heard you state that, but also I think speak to the experience a lot of people have of feeling like my value or my worth as a human is directly related to how much I can produce instead of the impact that I can make. And and we know that there's a lot of studies that back this up, that particularly for men, that becomes even more internalized than for women, right? Again, not in all cases, but often is the case. And so, one of the things when we talk about this idea of patriarchy, it can be really easy to focus on how does that negatively impact women or people who are not, right, like a white man in power. But it's equally important to talk about how some of those like rigid rules of how you should be and what your value is can also impact men. Mm-hmm. And so I would love to hear from like your experience and observations, this, like, what are the ways in which it negatively not only just impacts people, but specifically men, and even, like to expand on your own experience?
Well, like I've always felt like an underdog, basically, since I was a kid growing up and even going into the business world. And it seems if you're not that alpha male type, then your voice isn't heard. And you almost have to be like an over-exaggerated, version of yourself to actually be taken seriously.
Yeah.
And then you become labeled and, oh, you're that guy, or you don't want to be too big a complainer because you're rocking the boat too much. And
yeah.
And I think it's you see people who don't fit the mold and they're passed over because they think differently.
Yeah. And
then I always thought, like, we always wait till we're old and go, well, I should have done that better. Or now that I'm old, I know better. And I'm like, why wait till you're old? Why not start doing that now?
Yeah. That idea of not, of either being the underdog or feeling out like an outcast or like I don't belong, that's something that, again, we've explored in different episodes, particularly when you think about that idea of imposter syndrome. Yeah. Usually shows up for people who are in a situation. Neha Sampath, who we interviewed on this very, very early on in the show, described it so beautifully. It's like that typically shows up for people when they're in a system that wasn't built for them. Yeah. And so one of the things that I'm curious about to hear from you is, and this has been a personal reflection for me in a totally unrelated way, right? But like when you feel like you have to show up in a way that is different than like your truth, there is an amount of masking that you're doing. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, like for you, what was the cost of that masking to you, right? Of like, oh, I have to stretch, I have to show up in this way, I have to be more of that alpha male, I have to be more aggressive, I can't be emotional, I got to be tough and make the decisions and all of this. But like, there's so much exhaustion that happens when you feel like you have to show up in a way that is fundamentally different than what your true self is.
Well, I think it's like a mental imbalance almost, like, because you are putting on such a mask for your work or for that type of situation that you go back home to where it's supposed to be safe and you either let that mask go and become somebody completely opposite, or some of that stuff trickles into that atmosphere and then it doesn't work because it should be a softer place.
Yeah.
And I think now, like, even just because now I show up everywhere, it's me. Like, they know what they're getting, but it's almost a lonely road because nobody does that. So it takes a little bit of that kind of self-reflection and kind of pumping yourself up, going like, no, this is like, be genuine. This is who you are.
Yeah.
That's good enough.
Yeah. I think that, so many of us mask in different ways and depending on the situation and depending on your identity, right? Like we know that for some communities, they have to code switch in order to, be able to exist in maybe a dominant white culture or if, just a whole, it can look so many different ways. And I feel like what I observe in myself when I'm in those moments, when I see clients who are in those situations, our loved ones, is, there's this it's like this constant repetition that who you are is not good enough.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's this constant, like you can't just be you. And yet, damn, does it feel like an act of courage to just be you?
Mm-hmm.
At least it did for me. Like what was that? You know, you talked about it being a lonely road. And I'm just curious to hear, like, what were those moments like when you could intentionally see yourself, set down the mask and be like, nope, this is me. Like, what was possible for you in your journey?
Well, I think, honestly, everything was possible. Like I can remember, you know, so, and maybe this is too much information, but so my first wife left. I had 4 kids, so I became a single dad, dealing with all that. Then I got to the point where I'm like, am I becoming this, like identifying myself as this sad single dad guy? Or do I have an opportunity to, you know, move forward? So I kind of hit almost like a rock bottom.
Yeah.
And then I realized I have nothing to lose, you know, because I basically lost everything now. So now everything's open to me. So then it's just that freedom. Like you really start understanding that you're good enough. So it can be it's a hard journey because that's a hard lesson to go through.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
I think it's almost necessary.
And it's not like something you just wake up and go like, oh, okay, I'm gonna just be myself, right? Like I'm just going to, and even, you know, I actually just last night was talking with like a colleague / mentee peer, right? Somebody who's newer in her career. And, you know, she essentially kind of got feedback she's too much. And I was like, I mean, like too much for who? Too much for them? Like that, I mean, you're not too much, right? Like let's, you know, and just talking through like, how do you stay grounded and anchored to who you are and what that truth is? Cause it is there's something just really powerful with that. What do you feel like, you know, when we talk about this idea of patriarchy, masculinity, and I want to be clear, folks too who are listening, like this, I'm not anti-masculinity, and I'll say this, and there's an opportunity to expand it, just like there's an opportunity to expand all the identities of like, well, how do we just show up as our true self? And like, and I guess like, I think about these cultural expectations as rules. And so what I was curious about to hear from you is what are some of those sort of rules of masculinity, right? That you had to work to redefine or let go of, or say, yeah, I'm not going to do that anymore. That's not going to be how I show up. I mean, you already kind of mentioned some of them, but I would love to hear more.
I think just being, like, just really believing that I'm good enough. I don't have to push to the next level. I don't have to, you know, pursue the next dream, or I can go in a room and say, I'm just a white guy trying to work through life. Like I might not know the answer, and not be intimidated. Like I always say, you'll never find a guy ask for directions. And I was that guy too. Because it's like, oh my God, it's a weakness. Well, no, like just ask for directions. You can't do everything by yourself. It's impossible. You need that help.
Yeah.
And it's not a weakness. It's just, that's in your DNA.
Yeah. Yeah. It's and that's part of the, right, like the cultural conditioning, particularly as we think about like Western culture, right, which is maybe different than other places, is there's this, there's a lot of messages that men receive about this idea of like what makes you weak, right? Emotions make you weak. Close relationships make you weak. Asking for help makes you weak, right? Not knowing makes you weak. And God, isn't that it? Well, okay, like what is it? What is it about being weak that's such a threat? Well, I don't know the answer to that, but I'm curious to get your thoughts.
Well, I talked to he's a PhD friend of mine, and I said, you never really own yourself. Like when you're first born, you're given a name. You're told as a boy or a girl how you're supposed to act or who you're supposed to be. Then as you're growing up, you're told by your parents or by your friends and whatever, who you're supposed to date. And don't look at that person because you're settling, or that person is not right. And then you're trying to be defined by a job, and it's just, you're never really almost given that opportunity to just define yourself completely. Like even, and then that gets into the ownership. My second wife she doesn't take my name. That's a big deal to people. I'm like, it's a name. Like, and I can understand how, like, they might have known you as Sarah whatever before, and that's an identity.
Yeah.
And then if you get married and you change your name, well, that's a new identity.
Yeah.
So it's almost like, do I have to lose this person to become this person? Like, it's,
yeah.
So it's just a fascinating kind of thing.
It's, I really appreciate that. It's quite provocative, Lawrence, that idea of like, when do you actually get to own yourself?
Yeah.
You know, and reclaim it. And it's interesting. Nick's listening, and so he knows I'm going to tell this story, right? So like with the name, my identity always, right, was Sarah Noll, and nobody would ever, often people would never just call me Sarah. It was always Sarah Noll. And it's a huge part of my identity. And I'm giggling because it's my story too. So we're going for it, Nick. But like one of the things when we were first getting married and we were young, he was like, I don't want you to change mine, but I just like, there's something about like, I just want us to be on the same team. Right. And I didn't know any different, whatever. So now I'm Noll Wilson, which now that is my new identity. Yeah. But what I love is like, we just refer to ourselves as the Noll Wilson family. And we've even had conversations of like, maybe it's time for you to change your name to like Nick Noll Wilson. And like now we're officially on the team. But then I was like, it's such a pain in the ass to go through all that process. Oh my God, I'm not going to, like ask you. The reason I'm giggling about it is like, Nick forgot that he had asked me that. I was like, that was my wedding gift to you, is adding your name. But this idea of like all of the places that are shaping us and telling us like, well, in order for you to be successful, you need to look like this. In order for you to, like even something like professionalism, right? You got to wear a suit. You got to have a strong handshake. You got to make eye contact in order to be effective. You got to, right, like be assertive, when really like that's just one way of being effective. And like, I'm just like, I'm thinking back to like moments in my life right now where it's like, oh, that's when I started to go, no, this is who I am. Like, I'm going to own this right now.
I often think of like, so John Lennon, everybody was mad at Yoko Ono when he left the Beatles. And then he releases that song, Watching the Wheels. Maybe he was just done being a Beatle. Yeah. But we need somebody to blame, because it couldn't be him making that decision. Like, and it's the same thing here. Like, I've been told, well, you can't possibly be happy with what you're making right now. Yes, I am. Yeah. And I tend to have toys, like I'll bring one. So I have this on my desk. For people who are listening, it's a little Godzilla. Yeah. So and they're like, oh my God, you got toys. You're just like, they don't take you serious. I'm like, well, that's part of my personality. Yeah. Is that whole thing. So it's just, why can't that be part of the package? Yeah. Instead of, they always say, bring your whole self to work. Well, get ready, because this is all of me. Well, and sometimes I think that can feel threatening to people, or that can maybe, like, sometimes it can hold up a mirror of a different way of being that they maybe didn't think was possible for them, which I think is what's happening right now in our culture, where you do see, like, again, let's just look at it through the lens of men. Like,
more men talking about mental health, more men talking about how do we have relationships that are not just, if I'm in a heteronormative relationship that's not just with my girlfriend or my wife, how do we have better relationships with each other? How do we show more emotion? And I wonder if some of that like aggressive pushback we're seeing on this movement might come from a place of actual like sadness or maybe even fear of you're presenting something that I didn't think was an option for me. And like, I don't like that. So because I suffered, you have to suffer. Right. Like, and I'm curious, like just again, like in the conversations you've had, what's your experience been?
Well, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there, because I think it is that suffering or that fear of like, what do I do now? I don't know how to be in this space. And like, it sucks. I know since talking about this stuff or realizing things, like you almost realize how much suffering you're going through. And the person that can, cut through everything and be the most vulnerable with sometimes becomes the enemy, because then they're like, oh, you got to put a guard up because that's getting too far.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's that fear that if you go all the way, you're never going to come back, or you'll come back weaker. Yeah.
There's something about that language you used of, I don't know how to be in this space.
Yeah.
That's interesting to me, especially when, again, like most systems were designed by and for a certain type of man.
Yeah.
Right. That's the reality, right? I'm in the US, right? And our country was founded on male beliefs. Our system has been built on this, and how risky that is. I think that is something that I've seen in my friends, family, clients who've been in a similar journey for you of wanting to stretch differently, wanting to show up differently, and recognizing how risky that feels.
Yeah.
And again, isn't that there's something really sad about that, of like how risky it feels to just be yourself, how risky it feels to, to show up vulnerably or honestly, or God forbid, with tenderness, and how lonely that must, like that's something that Nick and I talk about a lot. Is I have an unbelievable support system of really powerful women that we talk, like, it's like, even just hearing you go like, oh, if you go too far, you might not be able to come back. And I'm like, oh, we go far. Yeah. Like we go far always. And there's something, so I'm a better person because of that love I receive and because of those people in my life. And it always has made me so sad that so many of the men in my life, they don't have that support system outside of if they have a partner or maybe a family member, things like that.
Well, and I don't know if you have it in the States, but there's that commercial now. And it's a football game, and there's two guys sitting there. And the one guy looks real sad. And the guy that just looks like a normal guy is sitting beside him. And it ends up being that normal guy that has the mental health issues. Like, we got to talk about that.
Yeah.
Like, you're supposed to teach your sons to be a certain way, but that the way doesn't work.
Yeah.
It's kind of frustrating because as a parent, you see that, it's like trying to teach somebody you don't need the latest and greatest item, but all your friends can have it, but that's just their problem. Like, well, it just takes a lot of the discussion, honestly, and that takes time. And I don't think time is a big commodity anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. Or it feels more scarce than it needs to, maybe. Like, right. And I'm curious, to that point of, as you've been exploring these topics around systems of oppression, as you've been exploring topics around like toxic masculinity versus more healthy masculinity, how has that shaped your relationships with your kids? And I'm sure, and I imagine, depending on how old they were, and also just the fact that they are right in this culture, that you may see moments where you're like, damn, I don't want you to keep it in, buddy. Like, I want you to be able to like express it. What has that evolution been like for you?
It's been good, because there's, like, I know my youngest one time broke down on the phone with me once. And I'm like, I said, you needed to do this so much before. And he goes, well, I didn't want you to be embarrassed or not be proud. And I said, I'm proud of you all the time and more now that you're actually comfortable to express yourself. And I think it's funny, as parents, you want to control everything so they don't have to, to help them.
Yeah.
But you almost have to let them go and learn, and then be there to help kind of pick up the pieces if necessary.
Yeah. Yeah. Like it's not a question of if, it's when, right? Like when they make mistakes, when they're hurt, when something happens to them.
Yeah.
What was, can I ask, not without going into detail, but I'm just curious. Like I love that modeling of validating, like, no, this is good. Actually, I'm even more proud of you because you're expressing that. How did your son show up in that moment? Maybe different than how he has before.
I think because it was a job situation and a very like masculine type. No, you gotta suck it up.
Suck it up.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And he just had enough.
Yeah.
And he was able to kind of unload and come up with a solution. And it wasn't like I was trying to tell him what to do. I was just saying, well,
yeah,
like I was listening more than talking, really.
Yeah.
And I think it opens up that space where they can, they can feel safe and go, yeah, I might not be doing what you're doing as a career. I might want to do something totally different. And this is frustrating me. And I don't want you to fix it. I just want you to listen.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so beautiful. And I think that, I'm always looking for the opportunities to pull out where like things people can try and practice. And one of the things that I appreciated about that example is, and this is true not just for like men, but just all of us, that when somebody takes a vulnerable step with you, when they share something that feels raw or right, like scary even, how do we in the moment normalize like, hey, this is normal, this is healthy, and you're absolutely safe with me. Because even just because that's something that I see, and we've talked about this actually in some previous episodes, is sometimes we don't know how to show up when somebody is emotional. Sometimes we don't know how to show up when somebody's struggling. And that, one of the most powerful thing we can do is to be present with them and to validate and be like, yeah, I'm cool with this actually. Like this is what it means to be a whole human with each other.
Well, I think even I've had conversations at work where like they're tearing up, I'm tearing up. Like it's just, you're sharing that experience rather than, trying to sit all stoic and just give them what they need to get them out of the office so you don't have to talk to them anymore.
Yeah. Right. Like you slide the tissues, like clean yourself up because it's uncomfortable for me. Yeah. And that idea of sharing the moment. I was fortunate, or I am fortunate. I should use present tense, not past. My dad was incredibly emotional, incredibly, and not even emotional. I hate using that. Let me rephrase that. Because when people are like, I'm not emotional, I'm like, what emotions don't you experience? Right. Like we're all emotional beings. Yeah. But I know the moments in a TV show that I was like, oh, the shoulders are starting to come. He's trying to withhold it. And it's one of the things that I appreciate so much is like, he normalized it for us. But there were times when I saw people make kind of jokes or like, oh, there's dad, he's crying again. Like he cries at everything. And like, nobody would ever say that, necessarily about a woman, but there's something I love, because my brothers are both very sensitive and, like can show that kind of emotion. And honestly, like I didn't realize how unique that was.
Mm.
Right. Like, and there's, again, it's something like Nick and I've had a lot of conversations of how do you reconnect to those emotions when you've essentially cut them off for so long? So what were some of the things, like either the way, like the questions you asked yourself, or the thoughts you had, or the people you engaged with, or what you were reading that you found particularly helpful as you were like reclaiming this whole side of Lawrence?
I think it's just understanding the story behind the person. Like I remember reading a eulogy once, or a funeral notice, and it was one of the guys he was an addict, like a bad addict in town, ended up passing away. And it started out, and it was his niece, I think. And she said, well, you might know him as such and such and blah, blah, blah. But I knew him as uncle. And then she went into this big description of who she knew. And it really made me think, like I can remember, and I was never homeless, but I remember eating out of a dumpster, not, and doing criminal activity, you could say, or whatever, but just like being that open.
Yeah.
And then seeing myself in the world now, and I tell everybody that, and they're like, oh no, you couldn't have been. You're a GM. I'm like, no, that's who I am. That's part of me.
Yeah.
So then I see like people, homeless people on the street, let's say, and instead of just passing them over, it's like, well, who were they before? And what little switch in their life created that, spiral into this?
Yeah.
Just to be a little bit more empathetic with them rather than, just write them off as wasted or whatever.
Yeah. It can be easy, I think, sometimes, like either to ignore or to judge instead of like being compassionately curious of like, nobody's born, right? Like nobody's born into this. We're all shaped in certain ways, and that impacts us. And like, and when we think about how we show up, right? Like there are these spoken and unspoken kind of rigid expectations, right? Like I should be nurturing as a woman. I should be a good cook. I should want to whatever. Like I should be, I don't know, like all the bullshit that and likewise, like, well, men, you should be tough. So I have loved this discourse that's been happening in the United States anyway. By the time this airs, this is going to air in a couple of months. So who knows? We could be in a very different state. And like, I don't want to go there yet. But like, but there's been this conversation of how do we expand? And maybe that's the better word than redefine, but how do we expand this idea of masculinity? And there's been a lot of conversations around this language of like modern masculinity and what that might look like. And obviously, like, toxic masculinity doesn't serve the person and it doesn't serve the people around them. So some people have used the language of tonic masculinity, like it's like a tonic to the soul. So I'm curious to hear from you, like, what words would you want associated with modern masculinity now?
I don't know about words specifically, but I think just the idea that nobody's getting out of this alive.
Mm-hmm.
You're not alone. We're all human people. So let's start being like, get that humanity back into people. And redefine what success is. Yeah. Because we're pushed with business, with media that you need to have this, you need to have that, and then you're successful. Well, when I retire, I want to get a small house, maybe 600 square feet. That's it. have no possessions, basically just live and just be. And I think that's where we're missing out, is we aren't accepting that as being successful.
Yeah.
Well,
it's like, I'm even catching myself in this conversation of masculinity, of like, we don't even have to limit it to that, right? Like it doesn't have to be, it's just like, what does success look like for you? What is a fulfilled life, right? Like, how does that, and that can be really difficult, because when there are so many, again, messages. I mean, this is something that I know Nick has talked on the show before, of he's incredibly creative. He has a high value on like around his artistry. He's an incredible partner to me, but like chasing the corporate leader, that was never going to be his path.
Yeah.
And like, and it took a long time for him to realize like that tension between like, oh, I'm supposed to be aggressive and I'm supposed to be assertive, or I'm supposed to be career ambitious, and like, that's just not me, caused a lot of pain and suffering for him. And again, I'm not sharing anything he didn't share in a previous episode. And getting to the place of like, well, no, success is creating, like supporting you. Success is being able to do the kind of work that I like to do. Success is being able, for us to be able to spend the time together like we want to. And it's hard sometimes when you're like, oh, but I'm supposed to have so many followers. Oh, I'm supposed to be making 6 figures. I'm supposed to be making, I'm supposed to have this car, or whatever the case is. But there's something so beautiful about just like, not like, I get going back to your point of like, you get to own your life.
Yeah.
You might not be able to control all aspects of it, right? Because of external factors, but how do you want to show up in that moment?
Yeah. Basically, I guess that would be the t-shirt slogan. I want my life back.
Oh, I love that. What's your wish for people? Like, we'll expand it, not even like, what's your hope or wish for people who are listening to this? And as we explore not just this idea of masculinity, but just the identities and the limitations and like, yeah.
I honestly hope people continue the conversation. Like, I've been in different online classes and stuff, and I said, you know what, I'd love to just show up and go for a walk in the park. Nothing more than just being in that space together. Because I think there's such a lack of that, and just that connectedness. And I think so many people are going in 800, like millions of directions, and we're banging into each other, but we're not actually connecting. We're more just ping-ponging. And I think that's where some of the problems become, is because you don't realize who you're connecting with. Like, I met James Hetfield, like lead singer of Metallica.
Okay. I didn't know who he was. Sure.
So we're walking on a school trip. He's sitting on a bench. I happened to walk by going, oh my God, that's so-and-so. So I stopped and talked. It was just, why not? He's a human being.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think we miss out on that so much because we're trying to be the best, or like you said, get the most likes, or, I need to have the perfect picture. I'd rather see the thing happen or see the experience than have a picture of it. And I think that's where you be you.
And create the space for other people to do the same. And and that's been the evolution of our relationship, is like, we should just like have regular chats and be like, oh, what are you thinking about? This is what I'm thinking about. What's happening in your world? Well, this is what's happening in my world. And you're right. Like, there's so much surface level, and like that visual of banging is so appropriate. Like, there's just so much surface level that we don't always slow down enough or know how to. Like, that's so much of the work we do, is just showing people how to be in conversation with somebody, have those high quality moments of connection, which helps with loneliness and helps with mental health and like so many things is being connected to your community.
Yeah. Well, and you think of on the farm, your socializing spaces around the kitchen table.
Yeah.
And you have like that percolated coffee and all that. You go to the city, it's in the living room.
Yeah.
Like even that dynamic is changing.
Yeah.
Where we should have more kitchen table talks, I guess.
Yeah. 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 Or like comfy in the couch in the living room just with the TV off, being able to explore that.
Yeah.
As we like wind down our time together, one thing that I always like people to think about is what would be some questions of reflection that you would offer our audience to think about for their own life, just related to all of this. Like what are some of those questions maybe you've asked yourself or that you have found valuable?
I think first off, I'd say don't believe anything you hear and question everything, because what works for somebody might not work for you. And don't be afraid to ask the questions. Because I think we get so stuck on, I might ask the wrong question. Well, then own it. Yeah, maybe that was the stupidest thing I could have asked, but sorry, I'm just trying to be legitimate and like actually be curious.
Yeah.
And I think don't be afraid to reach out, because I think everybody, including myself, we internalize so much.
Yeah.
And we need to let that out and get that connection again, because you never know. It could save you, save somebody else. It could create a very nurturing, like incredible relationship. And why not have that?
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Lawrence, since this is your first time on the show, you get the question asked that I ask everyone. And that is, what was a conversation you've had with yourself or others or someone else that was transformative for you?
That's a good question. I think just asking myself, like, basically, why am I like this, and why isn't that good enough? I think that's the gist of it, because I know what you said about Nick and his art. Like, I draw and paint too, and my dad used to say, well, you should do something else. Or you should go into commercial artistry, like your cousin. And it was just that being a boy in like a farming community going, well, I don't want to be a farmer. I would like to do this, but I don't have the support. So
yeah.
But yeah. And then honestly, these conversations like change it, because then it's like, it fills you up again, kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Why how did you say it? Why I didn't write it down. Yeah. Why am I like this? And why is that not good enough? Yeah. I think that is a very, especially that last part. Why is that not good enough?
Yeah.
Is really provocative. Lawrence, my friend, thank you so much for bringing your insights, your wisdom, your thoughtfulness, your gentleness. You're like one of the calmest people I know. You're like, we're just going to have this conversation. But I'm so glad that we were able to make it work out. For people who might be interested in connecting with you and having maybe a table talk conversation with you or learning more about your journey, what's the best way for people to connect with you?
Probably email's the best.
Yeah.
Like they can text and stuff, but I'm pretty horrible with social media and all that stuff.
So if you're comfortable, we'll list your email in the show notes. And then if you want to reach out, just let them know where you heard. But otherwise, Lawrence, thank you so much for coming on the show and having this conversation with me.
Thanks for having me. It's been awesome.
Our guest this week has been my dear friend and colleague from up north, Lawrence Weinrauch. And I I always love when I get to talk to somebody who's got such a different energy than mine. Like there's something so calming about talking to Lawrence, but there was a number of things that I wrote down. And the one that is really sticking with me is, when do you own yourself? When do you own your life? And boy, that, I don't know, that like makes me misty even thinking about. And, my friends, we really do love to hear from you. So let us know what came up for you, what resonated. What are you thinking about differently as a result? You can always send your thoughts to me via email at podcast@sarahnollwilson.com or my DMs on social media, where they're always open. And we would love to have your support of the show. There's two ways you can do it. The first is, if you haven't already, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show on your preferred podcast platform. The second way you can support is by becoming a patron. You can go to patreon.com/conversations on conversations, where a monthly contribution that's the same as getting coffee supports the team that makes this show possible. And speaking of the team, let's give them a little bit of love. To our producer, Nick Wilson, to our sound editor, Drew Knoll, to our transcriptionist, Becky Reinert, to our marketing consultant, Jessica Burge, and the rest of the Snowco crew. I'm so fortunate to call you all colleagues and friends. And a final thank you to Lawrence Weinrauch for showing up as his beautiful, authentic self. Well, that, my friends, concludes this week's episode of Conversations on Conversations. As always, thank you for being here, and being here for us, and being here for yourself. And remember, when we can change the conversations we have with ourselves and others, we can change the world. So till next time, please be sure to rest, rehydrate, and resource yourself. And I'll see you again soon.